And finally, when regulation pursues goals other than consumer welfare, it often did them in ways that maximize the sacrifice of consumer welfare. And to understand that, you need to understand the concept of unseen consumer costs. Usually when we think of cost to consumers, we think of what price do consumers pay for stuff. And it's true, regulation affects prices. But the other thing that happens when regulation affects prices, yeah, consumers may pay more, or in some cases they may pay less as a result of regulation. The other thing that happens, though, is consumers change their behavior in response to prices. And these behavioral changes can create unseen consumer costs. When you have regulation that increases prices to some consumers in order to subsidize others, the consumers whose prices increase are going to use less, or maybe fewer of them will subscribe if it's a service where the subscription or usage is very sensitive to price. Here's the basic logic of it. And here's the interesting thing. Where traditionally has regulation tried to increase consumer prices in order to create a pool of subsidies to subsidize other consumers? Typically, it's been on services whose demand is pretty sensitive to price. Wireless, universal service assessments on wireless is something I've studied a lot. And demand for wireless subscription and usage is pretty sensitive to price. Video, pretty sensitive to price. Broadband, we're not currently putting big taxes on broadband for other things, but on the federal level, some folks have proposed that maybe broadband ought to pay into the Universal Service Fund. Turns out broadband is very price sensitive, and if you put universal service assessments on top of broadband, you're going to get a big drop in subscriptions. Long distance service, historically, I actually still buy long distance service separately at home from my phone package. I realize that puts me in the minority. But when long distance was sold separately and priced by the minute, long distance was relatively price sensitive compared to the demand for access. And so when we essentially increase the price of these things through regulation or through taxation, we tend to generate big losses in value to consumers because since these services are price sensitive, consumers cut back, they lose the value that they would have received from those services, and the firms providing the services lose some operating profit on that last little group of consumers who drops off or uses less. Economists have put numbers on a lot of this kind of stuff. And, these things aren't I view any numbers I see out of economic studies with a certain amount of skepticism. I think the most that these kind of studies can tell us is, is the effect big or is it little? And if you look at a lot of these kinds of studies that look at various effects of traditional telecom regulation, you find that the effects are often kind of big. Federal universal service charges, a few years ago, calculated that in addition to the revenue that's raised by the USF charges, consumers lose an additional $1.2 billion of value each year. That's because they use fewer wireless minutes, because they don't subscribe to wireless service, because they use fewer long-distance minutes, or they buy a smaller bucket of minutes because the USF charges increase the price. Similarly, in Texas, the state that I've studied, there were some pretty big losses there as a result of the universal service charges. Big improvement in consumer welfare as a result of some reforms that Texas made to its universal service system the past couple of years. Interstate long-distance access charges, all these kind of things seem to lead to some fairly big losses to consumers. That big line item, all wireless add-on charges, $9.6 billion in addition to the revenue raised. That's add-on charges like universal service and various fees and taxes. Because if you look at a wireless bill, if you add up all the add-on charges, it's a pretty big chunk of the bill. Some other things. Jerry Hausman at MIT did a couple of studies where he looked at several decades ago when federal regulators were debating whether to allow the local phone company to offer voicemail using its network. Hausman calculated that as a result of that delay, consumers lost about $1 billion in value annually, and delaying the introduction of cell phones very early in the history of mobile telephony led to huge annual losses of consumer value because we value wireless service pretty highly. And finally, we have also looked at barriers to wireline video competition. We kind of extrapolated a fairly decent-sized benefit to consumers if we, in fact, got wireline video competition nationwide. Well, how do we know that we're getting to a competitive market in telecom? If we're saying, well, we may not need to regulate as much, we can rely on competition. How do we know where to get there? Well, there's a lot of answers that people give. Some of them are wrong. Some of them make some sense. One is the idea that the only way you have competition is if you have a whole lot of small companies competing. Now, granted, that may get you a competitive market, but you can also get the results of a competitive market even if you don't have numerous small companies competing. Another answer that's kind of sort of based on standards that federal antitrust agencies use to analyze mergers is that, well, gee, competition constrains price increases, so if the local incumbent can raise its price above the current regulated price and sustain that price increase, that must mean there's not a lot of enough competition. The logical problem there is that regulation has often held prices of basic services below what's called long-run incremental cost, which means even if the local incumbent raises prices somewhat, it may still not raise prices above the actual cost, which means competitors won't show up to constrain the price increase.